Welcome, everyone, to the fourth panel of the Schiller Institute Conference. In the spirit of Schiller and Beethoven, all men become brethren. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be the moderator of this panel, which is titled The Beauty of the Cultures of the World, a Dialogue Among Civilizations. We begin with a song of peace, Dona Nobis Pacem, followed by comments from Lyndon LaRouche from September 4th, 1994, What Makes Human Beings Unique?
Dona nobis pacem, pacem. Dona nobis pacem. Dona nobis pacem, pacem.
People talk about a lot of things and they evade the issue. The issue is the word imago Dei means nothing other, nothing different than, nothing substituted for. That power of creative discovery, which is typified by fundamental scientific discoveries, by discoveries of a type which cannot be represented by any syllogism, which cannot be represented by any formal logic, ideas which no Aristotelian could possibly ever understand. No Aristotelian has a soul or knows God, if they're consistent Aristotelian, because that method makes it impossible. And if you read the Ethics and Politics of Aristotle, you see what that leads to. Every abomination imaginable is possible if you do not have a conception of man as distinct from the beast, as in the image of God. And that which is in the image of God is the power to create in a way which no formalist, no formal mathematician of the generally accepted classroom type could possibly ever begin to understand. And therefore, do not try to reach cheap agreement with people on the question of the image of God. Well, I know what the image of God is. I'm in the image of God. They don't know what it is. And don't accept it from them. They don't know. You only know it if you know what creativity is, as I've described it. Now, if you know what creativity is, and understand that's the nature of man, that's the power of man to change man's behavior, is the source of man's power over the universe. Many people try to influence politics or influence events in other ways, except by creativity, and they will always fail. Because there's only one power for change which is efficient in this planet. And that is the power of creative discovery by the mind of a single individual. A power which is exemplified to any child by great classical poetry, by great classical music, by great classical drama, by great classical painting, and by the kind of discoveries of which I've been privileged to make a few in science. And it was because I understood that, because I had that experience, which unfortunately is rare today, of having made successfully a fundamental scientific discovery in defiance, in successful defiance of generally accepted classical mathematics, that I knew that as an individual, given the opportunity, we could change history with what became known as the announcement of the SDI. Not the implementation of the SDI, but the announcement of it, which is what changed history. The reason I bring this in here in answer to this question is, if one understands that, one understands what I mean when I say that we have the ability to intervene now in the course of events immediately before us, to do what has never been done in history before, to effect immediate and direct transition from the collapse of a 500-year-old system, a global system, and virtually without missing a step, to make the transition to a complete new system. To build the bridge from hell to purgatory as if in a single day. We can do it.
Okay, Dave, hit it. What you just heard was U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in a bar in Kiev on May 15th, 2024, performing Rockin' in the Free World. Be thankful I didn't include his favorite, Hoochie Coochie Man, recorded with his band with the subtle name Coalition of the Willing. Discordant sounds, out of tune, coherent with his visit to Kiev, to announce the delivery of still more U.S. taxpayers' dollars to prolong a lost cause. His choice of music was as offensive as his words, bewailing the suffering of Ukraine's citizens while delivering the funds to extend that suffering indefinitely in another of the collective West's endless wars. In a November 7th address to the Valdai Club in Sochi, President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, sounded a very different theme, speaking of the intent to build peace based on collaboration for development through the BRICS process. It is my deep conviction that the only new international system possible is one embracing polyphony, where many tones and many musical themes are sounded together to form harmony. If you like, we are moving towards a world system that is going to be polyphonic rather than polycentric, one in which all voices are heard and, more importantly, absolutely must be heard. Those who are used to soloing and want to keep it that way will have to get used to the new scores. In this panel, we'll be taking up an overlooked feature of statecraft, namely the cultural component, and what it means to engage in a polyphonic dialogue, which includes all nations. It's very easy to point to corruption and the greed and murderous immorality of the imperial establishment as the cause for endless wars. But why do citizens tolerate it? We inhabit a culture shaped by ugliness, in which the pursuit of brutal vengeance, which drives the indiscriminate slaughter of innocents in Gaza, is considered a legitimate act of self-defense. What is in the mind of those perpetrating such actions, and those like Blinken who defend them? that they think so little about the potential of the children they have incinerated and buried in rubble. In this unfolding civilizational tragedy, contrast that arrogant view, typical of the delusions of the gods of Olympus skewered by Greek tragedians, with the image of man embodied in the 10th principle of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's Principles of a New Security and Development Architecture. Helga wrote, "The basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul, and being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome." She continued, "A new world economic order is emerging. The European nations and the US must not fight this effort, but by joining hands with the developing countries, cooperate to shape the next epoch of the development of the human species, to become a renaissance of the highest and most noble expressions of creativity." We will demonstrate in this panel that this conception of the inherent goodness of man requires what Lyndon LaRouche described as mastery in musical composition and performance of the Socratic method illustrated by Plato's dialogues. In his piece, Politics as Art, from November 6, 2000, he wrote, "This is a method for locating, cultivating, and applying that noble authority which is embedded in human nature from birth, our innate authority sometimes identified as creative reason. It is when we communicate with one another in this way, on matters which the poet Shelley described as profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, that the power of reason born within us will be willfully aroused and shared with others. So, were our citizens not so often foolish, we would always rely on that method for assembling with others to shape the policies and future destiny of our nation and its relations with other nations. To accomplish what LaRouche has proposed, we need a renaissance today, reviving the best traditions of classical culture from all civilizations, resulting in a beautiful polyphony, moved by a love of mankind as a uniquely precious but presently endangered species. To open our panel, I'm delighted to introduce Diane Sare, who wears many hats: president of the LaRouche Organization, director of the Schiller Institute Chorus of Greater New York, and twice a candidate for US Senate for New York, providing a voice of sanity for the nation. Diane will speak on the topic, "Why is culture so important?" Hi, Diane.
Hi. Thank you very much, Harley, and good afternoon and good evening to everyone and to Helga. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor was a point of transition. The American use of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was another. Both were shocking and horrible. Each event was not an event, but the result of a dynamic of decisions shaped by underlying assumptions about man and nature, colored by the desire to achieve an intended result. It is undeniable that the world was instantly changed in an irreversible way after those actions. These were each actions which could not be undone. However, the unfolding of what comes after is something which still can be changed, and I believe is the subject of this panel. Why is culture important? Because it is the water in which we swim. It is the invisible ether which we breathe, and far too many people merely go with the flow without considering the assumptions about man and nature which shape our actions and decisions, most of which are unconscious. This is why George Washington, in his farewell address, warned that in a republic, such as the one he had fought to create, the United States of America, where the citizens would have the liberty to chart their own destiny, the questions of religion and education would be crucial. The rulers of the Roman Empire and the Anglo-Dutch oligarchs also understood this very well, and they ran what you could call cultural warfare, in which they strove to debase the image of man, to portray man as a beast, to be ruled through force and violence and threats of violence, as we see the desperate owners of the bankrupt transatlantic system trying to do. Like Thrasymachus, they have convinced themselves that might makes right, and that physical strength to impose mass suffering or terror equals power. They understand nothing about the universe, and therefore they always lose. As all true artists understand, it is man's nature to be free, not in an arbitrary way like a spoiled child, but in an educated way of humility, recognizing always that we don't know. But if we seek to understand and to abide by the principles of creation, since our universe is one of growth, not decline, if we seek to perfect our understanding in that way and conduct ourselves in harmony with universal principles, with ever increasing and improving understanding, we will prosper, and the universe itself will become richer and better because of our existence. Let's listen to Lyndon LaRouche on this question.
And therefore, we have to have ground rules for nation states. Our basic point is nation states, because nation states involve the concept of culture. Now, the power of creativity, which does not exist in monkeys, but should exist in people, even not among some politicians. The power of creativity is unique to mankind. All processes on this planet and beyond are creative. The inanimate nature is creative. Look at what happened. You had a sun. The sun is sitting out there. It was all by itself, spinning around rapidly, not knowing where to go, in this neck of our galaxy. Just that little sun. And the sun spun off some things. It created, it just spun out there, and it began creating the periodic table. The complete periodic table, which keeps growing and developing all the time through isotopes, some of which are generated by the aid of life-living processes. And so suddenly, now you had this, the sun suddenly became a whole solar system. And all these kinds of developments occurred. So the sun itself is creative. The universe is creative, inherently. Animal life is creative, but none of them can think. None of them have the ability for voluntary transformation of the universe. Only human beings have the mentality for the voluntary creation of new states of organization in the universe. And we need more people who are creative. We need to get rid of this uncreative nonsense which was introduced in the post-war period. We have to develop populations. Therefore, we have to realize that when you're dealing with a language culture, which is a very complex thing, it's not just the language, but a lot of other things. When you're dealing with a language culture, you have a certain depth of a faculty called irony, which exists in every language culture, which is generally expressed in the music and the poetry, the art, and so forth of that culture. And therefore, people, when you touch that aspect, which is deeply embedded in a national culture, you are getting close to where the creative powers of the individual lie. So what our objective must be, the nation state, is based on the idea of nation state culture. You must bring into play the creative potential of a people through its culture. Therefore, you want them to represent themselves in terms of the fulfillment and enrichment of their own culture. Therefore, we want the consent of humanity. We don't want a consent of pig pens. We want the consent of different cultures, because creativity lies within the culture. Therefore, we want an assembly of peoples which are respectively sovereign peoples in order to mobilize their cultural potential for becoming truly human as they can become. And it's the consent of these sovereign cultures which we must bring into play in order to finally achieve what Franklin Roosevelt intended when he designed the idea of the United Nations, was to eliminate all elements of oppression from this planet and to create a system of sovereign nation states, of developed sovereign nation states, which will then take over the entire territory of the planet, leaving no room for empires or similar kinds of phenomena. And bringing that together, that should be our purpose. So therefore we have some nations which have together the power, sufficient power, to free the slaves among the other nations. And our job is to free the slaves. Europe is a bunch of slaves. South America is largely a bunch of slaves. We must free them. And those nations which have the ability, the power, and the determination to do that must join on behalf of humanity as a whole. Because we're going to have to read another thing. We're going to go to Mars. Not this week. But we've got to get there. I won't be there. I will be there in spirit, and I don't know what I'll be able to do as a spirit. I do the best I can. Huh? Right? So therefore, mankind has a destiny.
Mars. How can we talk about Mars? You might say, look, I'm just worried about not being incinerated right now. And you're correct to be worried about that. We have some really crazy people like Tony Blinken, who is a rock musician, which is not irrelevant. What's the mindset of someone who struts around saying, I'm the hoochie coochie man? He's a moron and a pervert. A question of culture. Or is it a lack of culture? But we can't just think about momentary survival or our own little short lives. And we have so many people dying right now. We have to consider that they have not died in vain, that we are going to take it as a matter of personal responsibility that the 7-day-old baby buried under the rubble in Gaza has not died in vain, nor has the 57-year-old Ukrainian man who was kidnapped and forced to the front lines in a futile war against Russia, where he survived for 4 hours. Each of these people, like the American servicemen who died on this day in 1941, and the Japanese grandmothers who died in August of 1945, had a sovereign spirit, had independent thoughts, and was necessary in some way that they may not have understood. Their lives have been part of mankind, and it is for us to develop mankind to become a better species, where each child born can be confident that he or she will be allowed to contribute something to the immortality of the human species. What's involved in going to Mars? How do we get there? What will we breathe? What will we eat? What will our cities look like? Wouldn't it be easier if we had a base on the moon, where gravity is 1/6 that of Earth's from which to launch? We need a base on the moon. Russia and China are already planning to build one. They are even planning to build a nuclear power plant on the moon to power it. What are we doing in the United States? Well, we're spending enormous sums of money and deploying too many scientists to figure out if a man can become pregnant. We're abusing children. We have fools like Senator Lindsey Graham talking about how cheap and easy it is to use Ukrainians to kill Russians. And it's good for our economy, he says. Now we have Americans killing Russians in Russia with long-range missiles, and Russians killing Americans who are deploying these things in the position of military specialists in Ukraine. Does Lindsey Graham still think this is good? We have in the Western world, the rules-based democratic nations, a culture of violence. We call it a culture, but I would call it an anti-culture. It is a forced, well-funded, and propagandized effort to make us slaves and perpetrators of barbarism and to bring about our own doom. Think about this. Is it not natural to love a child? Why do we love children? Why do we delight when we watch a child make a discovery? Because the child represents the potential of perfection. It is nothing short of miraculous to watch the development of the mind of a child. And when we see a child singing beautifully or playing the piano with natural expression, we are moved to tears. How much effort has been expended to create a so-called culture or anti-culture, which not only tolerates the deliberate murder and starvation of children, but which delights in making a child suffer. This is a society which is doomed. When you destroy children, you are destroying the future. But this is also so hideously unnatural that it sparks a revolt. We see it on the campuses. We see it in the streets. We see literally billions of people on the planet rejecting this paradigm and collaborating to create a new paradigm, which recognizes the inherent dignity of each human being and the sovereignty of each human being and each nation as a protector of that principle. But it's not enough merely to revolt, as we should have learned from the French Revolution. We need a common purpose, which is in keeping with the self-perfection and ongoing creation of our universe, which the recently launched Webb telescope confirms. We are alive in the midst of a growing, expanding, self-developing universe. And if we seek to unlock its secrets, we will grow and prosper. If we try to go against this incredibly vast harmonic development of our universe by making arbitrary rules and imposing unnatural so-called cultural norms, which violate the innate free spirit of man, we will meet our doom. The challenges ahead of us are so great that we must shed the arrogance that our way is the only way of doing things. We must have the humility to recognize that a person who comes from a totally different perspective may bring something that we hadn't considered before, which resolves the paradox confronting us and lifts us to a new level of understanding. We should not be like the 6 blind men, relying solely on our sense of touch, trying to make sense of the various parts of the elephant. It may be that the man who doesn't touch the elephant at all, but instead uses his nose, can solve the mystery. So, let's figure out how to get to Mars. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Diane. If you've just joined us, this is the 4th panel of the Schiller Institute conference, and the title of it is the beauty of the beauty of the cultures of the world, a dialogue among civilizations. After the panelists will be taking questions and answers, and you can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat page. We're now going to be joined by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Helga founded the Schiller Institute 40 years ago with a mission to promote a classical renaissance to initiate a new era of truly human civilization. It's always an honor and pleasure to introduce her. So Helga, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello. Thank you that you reminded people of the anniversary of the Schiller Institute, because looking back, at the 4 decades of our work, and I would invite people to go to our archives and look at the origins themselves, it is quite notable that we were indeed quite prophetic in defining the issues which would be the relevant ones today. Because, we said that we absolutely have to have replaced the foreign policy of that time, which was basically, unfriendly relations, subversion, coups, various kinds of negative forms. We have to replace that with statecraft, meaning to advance the best in the other state in the hope that vice versa, this would be the attitude towards us. So it was very clear that the world was in an urgent need to have a more just new world economic order, but that would only function if it would be combined with a renaissance of the best traditions of all cultures. Now, that was a very ambitious idea, but I think if you look at how the evolution has occurred in the period since, that idea that you need a renaissance of the best traditions, has become a very prevalent idea. I participated in 2018 in Beijing in a dialogue of Asian civilizations. And I was one of the very few non-Asians there. And I must say it was an absolute astounding experience to see people from not only China, but India, Korea, Thailand, Afghanistan, various other places, who all would talk about the great traditions of their own civilizations, which in part go back up to 5,000 years ago. And they would proudly, emphasize what was the most advanced in this millennia old tradition, and how they would, use that to anchor the identity of their populations in this tradition to have a very positive idea about the future. Now, this was, referring to the old Vedic period in India, or the Bactria period of what is today Afghanistan, the Persian traditions, and so forth. Now, why is Europe and the United States not part of this discussion? I think the nail on the head was hit by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov a couple of years ago in his annual New Year's address, where he said that the problem was that the West had moved away from its traditional values, those values which were handed down from generation to generation, from the grandfathers to the parents, and that we had adopted a post-Christian value set, and that was the main problem, why also the communication between the Asian countries and, let's say, Europe and the United States has practically broken down. Now, why is it that people today in the West are so oblivious to the danger of nuclear war? I mean, we heard from Scott Ritter, from Ted Postol, and others, that the potential that this could go completely wrong is extremely high. And, in the beginning of the 80s, when we had the middle-range missile crisis, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets because they were worried about World War III. And now, where we absolutely are more close than at any time in history, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, only very few people are even concerned about it. the majority of people entertain their pleasure, their vacation, their various hobbies, but they're not concerned about what could happen to all of civilization. Now, has it something to do with the video Diane was showing about Secretary of State Blinken? I would say absolutely yes. Because, what has happened is that, when Lavrov says we moved away from our traditions and into post-Christian values, well, what was the best tradition we had in the United States? It was the American Revolution. It was the first war of independence against the British Empire, an anti-colonial war. And today, the British has taken over. You have basically an effort to maintain an unipolar world, which is no longer there, based on the Anglo-American special relationship, where the establishments of the United States have accepted to be in unity with the establishment of the British Empire and using that as a model to try to control to be hegemon in the world. Germany once had a very, very advanced civilization or culture, the German classical period, which includes everything in music from Bach to Handel to Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, even some of Hugo Wolf. But what happened to that? Germany has taken a completely different road. There are only few people who are still interested in classical music, relatively speaking, as compared to the largeness of the population. It's a tiny minority. Now, this started, obviously, almost 200 years ago with the attack of the Romantics on the classical period. And I can only emphasize, that, the Romantics who try to dismantle the height of classical principle, which in literature had reached the point between Goethe and Schiller, who revived the idea of the good, the truthful, and the beautiful, attacking that with the idea of the Romantic idea that the classical form is no good, that you have to replace the beauty with the interesting, and the interesting of today is boring tomorrow, so you have to replace it by a more interesting thing. And, obviously the taste goes down, the, culture becomes more degenerated down to the present level where everything is allowed. Now, Heinrich Heine, who wrote a very important book, which you should read if you want to deepen your insight into this period, which is called The Romantic School, where he joined with Goethe, not in that book, but in terms of opinion, the view that the Romantics were insane because they had lost all touch with reality. And if you look at the novels of, for example, somebody like E.T.A. Hoffmann, who literally went to the Charendon, the insane asylum in France at the time, to study cases for his novels, and you can tell by what came out as a literary product. What this did is it opened the way to step by step a more degenerated culture. So I'm not saying it started in the recent period. You have to really go back a long way. And, the definition given by Heine about the insanity, written in a very funny and polemical way, is extremely useful. But how is this relevant for today? In German history, despite the horrors of the National Socialist period of 12 years, they had not been able to completely eradicate the tradition of classical music, of classical poetry, even so the Nazis became quite afraid of, for example, Wilhelm Tell from Schiller, because they thought that this could be taken as a guideline to get rid of Hitler. So it was not so easy. But, when the war ended in 1945 and all of Germany lay in a horrible rubble field, many cities did not exist anymore, there was an incredible moment where people were searching their soul, saying, what can we do that this never happens again? And there was, for a short period of time, the revival of a debate about natural law. You had Schlussnuss giving concerts basically in bombed out factories. And there was a short period where it would have been possible to reconnect Germany to its classical tradition. And then what happened was that the occupying powers, especially the Americans and probably the British, yeah, for sure the British, they decided that the key thing was to separate the Germans from their culture as a matter of control and force them step by step to adopt the Anglosphere cultural paradigm. In education, this was meaning that meant getting rid of Humboldt and replacing it by Dewey, replacing natural law by case law of the American system. And in culture, it meant to sort of make classical music just one of many, and no concert should happen anymore without modern music, 12-tone music, atonal music. And for this purpose, the Congress of Cultural Freedom was developed, which was a gigantic effort for cultural manipulation in the post-war period. They controlled every concert, every performance, and even excellent musicians who had nothing to do with that were part of it because there was simply no other possibility to perform. At the height of this global operation, which also had operations in Africa and Asia, they controlled 120 cultural magazines, and this only got interrupted a little bit in 1967 when the scandal blew up that this was financed by the CIA and that the entire Congress of Cultural Freedom was a CIA operation, which obviously had to do a lot with Truman taking over from Roosevelt after Roosevelt had died. But, and I can only suggest, go into the libraries, look at the documents. You will be absolutely shocked also that is not much a topic of discussion today, because a lot of modern art is the result of this operation. And, obviously a lot of this art is extremely ugly. And Schiller had maintained that beautiful art has to be beautiful, or it should not be even called art. So that was the first wave, the CCF. Then came the next wave, which was basically the OECD in 1967. No, it may have been in it was maybe 1963. I'm not sure now. The OECD, under the leadership of Dr. Alexander King, who also played later an evil role in the Club of Rome and the thesis of the limits to growth, which was mentioned at the conference earlier, they basically started to have an education reform with the explicit aim to get rid of Humboldt, who had the idea of that the goal of education has to be the beauty of the character, and that there are certain subjects which are more suitable to have such a beautiful character as a result than others. The command of the high language as expressed in the best poetic traditions, universal history, the sciences, and so forth. So they said, let's throw out the entire baggage of 2,500 years of knowledge, Plato, all of this should go out. And they did. They eliminated all of these things from the education curriculum. And Lyndon LaRouche said famously several times that he, knowing the Germans, would think that those people who had gone to school before the education reform and those who went to school afterwards were like two entirely different species. And I think that there was an absolute point. Now, LaRouche also was, in my knowledge, the only individual who recognized in the 60s with absolute precision the evil influence of the sex, rock, drug counterculture, the hippies, the flower power, as being potentially the most corrosive thing which would destroy the cognitive potential of every society which would indulge in such counterculture. And again, look at the video with Blinken and judge yourself if LaRouche was right. So, many people thought at the time, oh, the hippies, that's something nice, San Francisco, that's all beautiful. But, what it does to the mind, we see today in the youth culture, the suicide rates, the drug addiction, the general collapse of the cognitive powers as compared to, let's say, of many pupils in Asia. Now, why was this so absolutely devastating? Because the classical culture was related to the idea of beauty, of elevation of the mind, of self-improvement, of permanent lifelong learning. And if you think back that Schiller, who did represent, together with Beethoven, the highest point of German culture ever. I asked Lynn at one point, who do you think was the best German who ever lived? And to my happy surprise, he said Friedrich Schiller. I said, really? Do you mean? He said, yes, absolutely. And that is why, not why, but that is in cohesion with why I decided to call the Schiller Institute, because Schiller has given us, with his aesthetical letters and his other aesthetical writings, a method how to improve people, how to ennoble the character. After all, Schiller came to that conclusion after he was very disappointed about the collapse of the French Revolution, where in the beginning he had the hope that it would be a repetition of the American Revolution on European soil. But then when the Jacobin terror took over, he was completely upset and horrified. And he wrote these aesthetical letters with the idea that a great moment, the French Revolution, had found a little people that the objective chance for change was there, but that the subjective moral possibility in the people was lacking to use that chance. So he set out to develop a method so that the next time a great opportunity of history would come around, that people would be better equipped. And he wrote these aesthetic letters, which I would suggest to you should be your reading material over the Christmas period, because it is the kind of literature which really gives you an answer to what to do about the situation today. What Schiller did in these letters was to basically say, where should the improvement come from when the governments, the states are degenerated and the masses are barbaric? Where should it come from? And he gave for some surprising answer, it comes through great classical art. Because it is when the ordinary person, the baker, the hairdresser, the engineer, just a normal average person who doesn't think about the large issues of mankind every day, is confronted with a great composition, a great drama, a great poetry, or some other great piece of art. It elevates the person because it speaks to the reason, but it is also speaking to the emotions. So it educates the emotions eventually on the level of reason, and therefore is suitable to develop people to a higher level of their capability. And Schiller said every human being has potentially an ideal person within him, and it is the great task of his existence to bring into conformity that potential with that ideal man. So the answer is everybody has the chance to become a beautiful soul. A beautiful soul, according to Schiller, is a person who has educated his or her emotions to the level of reason so that he or she can blindly follow these emotions without ever being led in a wrong direction. And a person who does his or her duty with passion, and for whom basically reason and love is the same thing. And the only person for whom that condition is fulfilled is the genius. So according to Schiller, every person has the potential to become a genius if you put a lot of effort in it. So to destroy that idea and to replace it with the idea of everything goes, you don't have any standards anymore. The deconstruction of all morality has reached the point where the more crazy some proposal is, the more chance you have to make it in the tabloids, to be celebrated as a influencer of some sort. And that is why today we in the West are really in a deep, deep cultural crisis. And when the Cold War ended, and Francis Fukuyama declared hubristically, full of hubris, not hubristically, full of hubris, this was the end of history, meaning that the Western democracies would export the Western democratic model to all countries of the world, and the whole world would accept that, and that would be the end of history. Now, as we have seen in the 30 plus years since, that didn't go so well. And, if the present condition of our culture, wokeism, the LGBTQ 99 gender culture is attempted to be exported to Africa, to Hungary, to Russia, to China, these countries say, no, thanks. We have our own traditions, which are much more in line with what we think should be our identity, and they reject the imposition of this foreign cultures. So we in the West have now a very serious cultural problem. I think that the cognitive potential of all of our societies is very much down. Germany, which used to be a country where, which was admired in the whole world. And if you would travel as a German to, places in Latin America, Africa, India, they would always say, oh, you're coming from Germany. That's the country of the inventors, of the thinkers, of the poets. What about Beethoven? What about Goethe? And now people say, oh, you come from Germany, you poor thing. Your economy is collapsing. You have a chancellor who is not even defending the sabotage of Nord Stream 2. You have exploding energy prices. Why are you not doing anything about it? Well, I think it all has to do with the fact that our cognitive potential has gone down, and people are so deprived that they do not recognize anymore the mortal danger of the possibility of having a nuclear war. And that has everything to do with our cultural taste, or taste of terrible stuff which people call culture. But it's really, if you look at the depravity of some of the pop music, or the image of man or image of woman in particular, which is why the Chinese have forbid hip hop, because they say the image of woman associated with hip hop is depraved, and therefore we don't want to expose our children and youth to that. And there you see that the accusation that some of these other cultures would be dictatorships and autocratic and so forth, that's just baloney. What it is, the Chinese culture, for example, they have a 5,000-year-old history. The last 2,500 years of that has been very much influenced by Confucius, who had the idea of lifelong learning. And therefore, since the Chinese tradition also puts the common good in front of the individual, saying that if the state progresses, then all the individuals progress, while in Europe and the United States, it's more the other side around, where the individual is put up front, saying if all individuals do well, then the state does well, which has led to this exaggerated individualism what we see today. But from the standpoint of the Chinese, it's quite normal that they would try by the state to keep those influences away from what they know is bad for the culture of the people. This is not something having to do with the Communist Party. It has to do with the 2,500 years of Confucianism. Anyway, I could say a lot more, but I think, what we have to do in the West is we have to really look at the rest of the world and recognize that we have lost the way. This exaggerated individualism, this idea that everything is allowed, that there is no limit in the perversion what you can pursue, has been devastating for our own culture and our own mind. And that it would be so easy to rediscover what was great about European culture, of which the United States is an extension. We have to go back to the Italian Renaissance, the École Polytechnique, the Andalusian Renaissance, the German classical period. And we have to revive these wonderful ideas and make them again a basis for creating something new. And then if we pursue a dialogue of the best tradition of European culture with the best traditions of all of these other nations and civilizations, we can get a new renaissance. And I think if we do our job right, it can be the most important and beautiful renaissance in the history of mankind ever, because man is capable of reason, and we should undertake this task with energy.
Thank you, Helga. I will say that there are two magazines I know of which are not controlled by the Congress of Cultural Freedom. That's Leonora and Ibicus, two publications of the Schiller Institute. They're on the screen now. You can subscribe. You can go online to theschillerinstitute.com and sign up for these two magazines, which are at the front edge of the creation of a new renaissance. Our next speaker on this panel is Bill Ferguson. Bill is a leader of the Schiller Institute in the Boston area. His topic is Poetry Must Supersede Information in the Affairs of Men. Go ahead, Bill.
Friedrich Schiller, the poet of freedom, begins his essay on the sublime. No man must. The will is the species character of man, and reason itself is only the eternal rule of the same. All nature acts according to reason. His prerogative is merely that he act according to reason with consciousness and will. All other things must. Man is the being who wills. Man's freedom is violated when he is subject to the external compulsion of slave master or tyrant. But is man free if his internal impulses are in conflict with reason? Schiller upheld the ideal of a beautiful soul, one in whom reason and feeling, duty and passion coalesce, he who does his duty with joy. As he states in his letters on the aesthetical education of man, it is beauty through which one proceeds to freedom, or as he expressed poetically in The Artists, only through the morning gate of beauty do you penetrate into the land of knowledge. Just as the rational powers of the student must be educated, Schiller demonstrates that it is the joyful duty of the artist to educate the emotions of the audience so that they delight in the beautiful, the harmonious, the truthful, so that they leave the theater as better people, and that they eventually come to delight only in the beautiful, harmonious, and truthful. It is the artist's duty to playfully guide them in becoming beautiful souls. Thus are citizens elevated to the capacity of self-government, the only government that is worthy of the dignity of man. But aesthetical education and self-government require, as does poetry, a common language for the deliberation and development of a people, hence the necessity of national sovereignty. As Joan of Arc says of the English invader in Schiller's The Virgin of Orleans, the stranger prince who quits a foreign shore whose fathers' graves are not dug in this land. How can he love it? He was never young among our youth. His tongue is strange to us. Our accents wake no echo in his heart. How can he be our father and our king? Schiller's works depict the love of and struggle for freedom of all mankind. The defense of national sovereignty in France, led by the divinely inspired Joanna, the revolt of the United Netherlands against Spanish rule in Don Carlos, and William Tell, his drama of the rebellion of the Swiss against Habsburg tyranny, wherein the Rutli scene can be considered a German translation of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. No, there is a limit to the tyrant's power. When the oppressed can find no justice, when the burden grows unbearable, he reaches with hopeful courage up into the heavens and seizes hither his eternal rights, which hang above, inalienable and indestructible as stars themselves. In 1984, the Schiller Institute issued the Declaration of the Inalienable Rights of Man, a universalized restatement by Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the American Declaration of Independence, applying its principles to all of humanity. What else is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if not the right to develop one's mind and one's heart to its fullest potential? The right to participate in what Schiller called the most perfect of all works of art, the construction of a true political freedom. The right to become a beautiful soul. As we strive now and hope for a future beyond this current punctum saliens, where we witness 3,000-fold, as Schiller's Stauffacher warns, that war spares not the tender infant in its cradle, and threatens soon to spare none of us, let us turn again to our dear departed Lyndon LaRouche. In Kepler's discovery, mathematics is not science, LaRouche refers to his assertion of 1978 that poetry must begin to supersede mathematics and physics. The second chapter, Poetry as Science, concludes with a subsection, In Defense of Beautiful Souls. The subsection begins, there are two works from classical English poetry. One, John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and the other, Percy Shelley's In Defense of Poetry, which have affected me most strongly since my adolescence. The first, for its achievement of the quality of a perfectly ironical classical poem. The latter, especially its concluding long paragraph, peering into the mirror of my soul. In all valid science and true classical artistic composition and its performance, the quality of message which sets the product of human creativity apart from the beastly creature's emphasis on simple literal pointing is what is called classical irony. As LaRouche ends the article, he first quotes Percy Shelley. The person in whom this power to lead society to great advances in the human condition resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are compelled to serve that power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit. And they are themselves, perhaps, the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of their age. Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not, but moves. Here LaRouche concludes, sometimes I think of the period of association of Goethe with Schiller, but then I think at other times of another side. Here in poetry, we sense the dynamic principle of all those discoveries which empower the individual to generate ideas of principle which move societies and the planets too. Science moves planets. Classical artistic genius moves the individuals who move the society, who will move the planets, then the stars, and then, perhaps, the galaxies too. In honor of the revolutionary and ever optimistic Lyndon LaRouche, let us move our societies and our planet in hope. Hoffnung. Es reden und träumen die Menschen viel von besserem künftigen Tag. Nach einem glücklichen goldenen Ziel sieht man sie rennen und jagen. Die Welt wird alt und wird wieder jung, doch der Mensch hofft immer Verbesserung. Die Hoffnung führt ihn ins Leben ein. Sie umflattert den fröhlichen Knaben. Den Jüngling begeistert ihr Zauberschein. Sie wird mit dem Greis nicht begraben, denn beschließt er im Grabe den müden Lauf. Noch am Grabe pflanzt er die Hoffnung auf. Es ist kein leerer, schmeichelnder Wahn, erzeugt im Gehirne des Toren. Im Herzen kündet es laut sich an. Zu was Besserem sind wir geboren. Und was die innere Stimme spricht, das täuscht die hoffende Seele nicht.
Thank you for that, Bill. Let me remind you that we will have a question and answer session after the other panelists speak, and you can send your questions or comments to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, our next speaker is Paul Gallagher. Paul's lifetime of work exemplifies the concept of the coherence between the laws of the universe and the creative power of the human mind. He's going to recite two poems by Robert Frost, Mending Wall and The Tuft of Flowers. Paul?
The idea that all human beings are adversaries, opposing each other, even when they are trying to build the same thing. Mending wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. It makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone upon a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves and some are nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across to eat the cones under his pines. I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the time of mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it because there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I'd build a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling out or walling in, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. That all human beings are brothers, that's an idea with a cause that is for poetry and music to discover. The tuft of flowers. I went to turn the grass once after one who'd mowed it in the dew before the sun. The dew was gone that made his blade so keen before I came to view the leveled scene. I looked for him behind a row of trees. I listened for his whetstone on the breeze, but he had gone his way, the grass all mown, and I must be, as he had been, alone. As all must be, I said within my heart, whether they work together or apart. But as I said it, swift there passed me by on noiseless wing a bewildered butterfly, seeking, with memories grown dim or night, some resting flower of yesterday's delight. And once I marked his flight go round and round, as where some flower lay withering on the ground, and then he flew as far as eye can see, and then on tremulous wing flew back to me. I thought of questions that have no reply, and would have turned to toss the grass to dry, but he turned first and led my eye to look at a tall tuft of flowers by a brook. A leaping tongue of flame his scythe had spared, beside a reedy brook his scythe had bared. The mower in the dawn had loved them thus, by leaving them to flourish, not for us, nor yet to draw one thought of ours to him, but from sheer morning gladness at the brim. The butterfly and I had lit upon, nevertheless, a message from the dawn that made me hear the wakening birds around and hear his long sigh whispering to the ground and feel a spirit kindred to mine own, so that henceforth I worked no more alone, but glad with him I worked as with his aid, and weary sought at noon with him the shade, and dreaming, as it were, held brotherly speech with one whose thought I had not hoped to reach. Men work together, I told him from the heart, whether they work together or apart. The author of both is the American poet Robert Frost.
Thank you for those recitations, Paul. Our next speaker is John Sigerson. He's a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, the music director for many years of the Schiller Institute, and his work with his late wife, Renee, on music and art has been an inspiration to those who knew her. John will be speaking on the unique role of the German leader. John?
Helga Zepp-LaRouche has asked me to devote my allotted time and space to providing you with some tools for understanding just why Lyndon LaRouche and his associates are so focused on all this music stuff. I'll begin with some general remarks on how urgent it is for you and for those whom you organize to add great music composed by Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, and others to your mental and spiritual armamentarium. And if some of what I present makes you a bit uncomfortable, I've done a good job. I'll then touch upon some key aspects of the uniqueness of those composers' art songs, or Lieder, as the most effective gateway to a working grasp not only of great music, but also of great poetry and drama in general. I'll do this by way of a Lied composed by Franz Schubert, based on a poem by his friend Franz von Schober, titled An die Musik, or Ode to Music. Let's begin with some quotes from a 1977 article by Lyndon LaRouche, which I've just rescued from among the 23,000-odd newspaper pages of the LaRouche Movement's newspapers, New Solidarity and New Federalist, published between 1970 and 2006. It's titled The Florestan Principle in Art, a reference to the character Florestan in Beethoven's opera Fidelio. LaRouche writes that great art has a demonstrated function for alleviating neurotic disturbances and stimulating the creative potentialities. Not accidentally, it is by stimulating the individual's creative potentialities that neurotic impulses are most efficiently checked. A population which lacks enjoyment of great art, great music most emphatically, is not only culturally impaired in the ordinary sense of that term, but is deprived of a means for improvements in its qualities of moral judgment and creativity in general. More specifically, about music, LaRouche says that music is the most efficient medium in which to situate the treatment of art generally. Music emerges and constantly re-emerges from the prosodic qualities of the spoken language, and is a medium for concentrated evocation of the affective correlatives of that language. The relationship of language to the individual's consciousness in general, the individual's conscious and preconscious notions of social identity, makes music the most social of the art forms. LaRouche continues, within music generally, song and opera have the advantage of immediately subsuming drama and poetry. Song is the Rosetta Stone connecting speech to music in general. The current state of musical comprehension and taste constantly measures afresh the capacities of a people respecting drama and poetry. A culture which loses the impetus for fostering and enjoying great music cannot produce great drama or great poetry. Now, a bit later, I'll let Lyndon add a choice remark about today's degraded and degrading popular songs and their equally degraded lyrics. I wouldn't turn them poetry. I wouldn't turn them poetry by any stretch of the imagination. But let's jump right in and look at Schober's two-stanza, very condensed poem, An die Musik. I'll read the text aloud in German, along with my own translation. The first stanza goes like this. Du holde Kunst, in wie viel grauen Stunden, wo mich des Lebens wilder Kreis umstrickt, hast du mein Herz zu warme Lieb entzünden, hast mich in eine bessere Welt entrückt. Or in English, O thou lovely cherished art, in how many gray, dismal hours, where I lay entangled by life's wild coil, hast thou ignited my heart into the warmth of love, hast transported me into a better world. Did you notice something odd about that first stanza? Well, consider that it doesn't say gray, dismal hours when I lay entangled, but instead it uses where, as if a length of time were a physical location. Now let's see how that works in the second stanza. Oft hat ein Seufzer deiner Harf entflossen, ein süßer, heiliger Akkord von dir, den Himmel besserer Zeiten mir erschlossen. Du holde Kunst, ich danke dir dafür. Often a sigh flowing from thy harp, a sweet, sacred harmony from thee, has opened for me the heaven of better times. Thou lovely art, for this I thank thee. The heaven of better times. So this is a space-time ambiguity, the kind of ambiguity or paradox which is the hallmark of any decent poem. Such ambiguity or paradox is the proper meaning of the term metaphor. In this case, it lifts you, or it ought to lift you, into considering that the location of the poet's idea is neither in linear space nor in linear time, but rather in some higher physical domain that encompasses both. Let's see what LaRouche has to say about this space-time and matter ambiguity. LaRouche writes, the physics analogy for this is as follows. Instead of imagining space-time as measuring displacements according to a fixed reference scale, imagine that forward displacements of a space-time matter continuum change the ostensibly linear scales employed for the preceding moment. Imagine that this change in the basis measurement is of such a form that instead of measuring displacement of the developing continuum according to linear scalar magnitudes of increments of time, distance, mass energy, and so forth, that the scale of measurement is a series of numbers determined by an exponential function. That is perhaps the best heuristic representation of the general idea for today's ordinary informed consciousness. So now, while you're still rolling that around in your head, let me sing Schubert's setting of the poem. This time, don't look at the poem text, just listen.
Du holde Kunst, in wie viel grauen Stunden, wo mich des Lebens wilder Kreis umstrickt, hast du mein Herz zu warmen Lieben entzünden, hast mich unsere Welt entrückt. O tat ein Seufzer deiner Harfe entflossen, ein süßer, heiliger Akkord von dir. Den Himmel bessere Zeiten mir erschlossen, du holder Kunst, ich danke dir dafür, du holder Kunst, ich danke dir. Now, what makes this song different from a simple melody? Well, it's the subtle polyphonic interaction between the singer's voice and the so-called piano accompaniment. In effect, the singer is simply the most prominent among a number of choral voices played by the piano. First, let's examine what the pianist's right hand is doing. These may seem like chords, but in fact, they're a condensation of three separate voices from the bottom: tenor, alto, and soprano. They just happen to be singing their own lines together at this point. And what about the voice in the left hand? Does this sound familiar? This voice is clearly a second solo voice, singing the same intervals as the singer's voice, but in a lower register with a polyphonic displacement. Now, let me sing the singer's part while playing only the bass line. Du holder Kunst, in wie viel grauen Stunden war mich des Lebens wie der Kreis umstrickt. Dass du mein Herz so warme Liebe entzünden, hast mich in eine bessere Welt entrückt, in eine bessere Welt entrückt. Therefore, the idea of this lead lies not in any single voice, but in the movement and development among and between all of the voices. Now, I only have time to show you one other important aspect which this lead shares with all others, namely the adjustment of the main key of the piece, in this case D major, to the requirements of the registers of the human singing voice or voices. In this case, the topmost note of the climactic phrase Ich danke dir dafür must be sung in the third high register of the soprano or tenor voice, and not screamed out in the chest voice, which I will not demonstrate. Du holde Kunst, ich danke dir dafür, Kunst, ich danke dir. And now, listen to how Schubert adjusts the alto voice in the right hand accordingly. Such subtle adjustments in voicing are part of what makes the German Lied so unique. But of course, other cultures are welcome to join in the polyphonic fun, and some have done so to a certain extent. So, where does that leave you with my favorite popular songs? As I promised, I'll let Lyndon answer that question. He writes, "A person who enjoys rock or prefers romantic kitsch is invariably a moral mediocrity under closer scrutiny. Romantic musical kitsch belongs to the department of the belly laughs after the third or fourth beer, the second bottle of wine. Such moments occur in the life of a creative person, but they occur as other moments. The person who lacks the habit of great art, the habit of profound excitement in the experience and contemplation of great art, is a deprived, diminished person. Without the development of the inner mental faculty for hearing the content of the music, only the stultified senses are stimulated in a superficial way. Without creative insight, art ceases to be art and is degraded into a mere matter of differences in the banalities of private taste." And so, I hope that in this brief sketch, I've given you at least a foretaste of the banquet of creative joy that awaits you if you decide to come to the table. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you for that, John. And I'm sure this has stimulated a lot of questions, including a couple that I have for you. So we'll get to the questions in a few minutes after the next two speakers. And again, send your questions to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can post them in the chat page. Our next speaker is Liliana Gorini, the chairwoman of Movisol, which is the Italian organization of the LaRouche movement. Her topic is "Music is the trait d'union of cultures and a messenger of peace." Welcome, Liliana.
I first got in touch with Sebastiano Brusco in 2019, after his first concert tour in China, in which he played works of Mozart, Schubert, and Chopin in the lower tuning of A432, and the China Daily reported on it. He is aware of the Schiller Institute campaign to lower tuning and go back to Verdi's tuning, a campaign I started in Italy on behalf of Lyndon LaRouche in 1988, with a conference at the Casa Verdi in Milan with Verdi baritone Piero Cappuccilli and famous soprano Renata Tebaldi. He endorsed Helga Zepp-LaRouche's call on China and joining the Belt and Road. In 2019, Italy was the first European country to join the Belt and Road initiative of President Xi Jinping, also thanks to Michele Geraci, who was a speaker yesterday. And the Schiller Institute and Movisol had a conference in Milan with Geraci and Helga Zepp-LaRouche speakers on the new Silk Road and Italy, just a few days before Italy joined. Unfortunately, the present government of Premier Giorgia Meloni, under heavy pressures from the Biden administration, decided to leave the Belt and Road Initiative and has been supporting the war in Ukraine. But as Sebastiano Brusco often writes on his official page, the Italian population does not agree We would like to have peace and economic and cultural cooperation with Russia, China, the BRICS, and the rest of the world. An indication of this was Brusco's concert tour in China in November. In an interview to a Chinese TV, Brusco explained that his 2 concert tours in China changed completely his view of China and the Chinese people, as everybody should do, since Western media give a wrong picture of this beautiful country, as he said, and beautiful people who work hard and love music and culture. During my concerts, he said, and my presentation on tuning and interpretation at the main Chinese university in Beijing, I discovered that Chinese people love the same things as Italian people. Our cultures are very similar, and their classical culture is very ancient. He played also a Chinese piece called My Motherland, which is, as he said in the interview, is about 2 lovers like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. He participated to an important conference on Marco Polo, in which Puccini music was played and commented. President Xi's wife was an opera singer. He visited an exhibition in Shanghai on Marco Polo, which also had an original manuscript of Dante's Divine Comedy. Music, he said, is the trait d'union of cultures and messenger of peace. He played at the Shanghai Oriental Arts Centers. All concerts were organized by the regional Chinese government to promote peace and cooperation among people. On November 9th, also the president of the Italian Republic, Sergio Mattarella, was on an official visit in China, and President Xi Jinping gave him as a present a piece of the moon, or of the lunar soil collected by an Italian satellite, to emphasize the importance of cooperation between Italy and China on space research. Both Mattarella and Xi spoke on the importance of culture to achieve peace. But this present had also a metaphorical meaning. In the Italian language, chiedimi la luna means make the best possible gift to me, give me the moon. The Italian media tried to ignore or misquote President Mattarella, but it is clear that this visit was in strong contrast with the policy of war and trade war of the European Union. A few days ago, also the famous Italian conductor Riccardo Muti was in China for the Italian Opera Academy, which was created there, and posted a video of his master class with Chinese conductors. My comment to his post was, thanks God, China supports Italian opera differently from our country. He put a heart under my comment. I had met Muti at La Scala in 1988 during the conference on Verdi tuning in Milan. His wife was also an opera singer, so he did like the conference. Despite the official stand of the Italian government, artists and the Italian population want to go back to our Renaissance tradition of searching for beauty, as Brusco put it. And China is a great ally in this. Or, to quote Dostoevsky, beauty shall save the world. I am convinced it will. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Liliana and Sebastiano. And I think Liliana will be on with us for the question and answer session. We have one more presentation, and then we'll be having a general discussion and a dialogue, which you can participate in. If you have questions and comments, send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, this is the fourth panel. Today, the title of the panel is The Beauty of the Cultures of the World, a Dialogue Among Civilizations. And our next speaker is Nader Majd, the president and director of the Center for Persian Classical Music in Vienna, Virginia.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Nader Majd, and I'm the president and the director of the Persian Classical Music Co. in Vienna, Virginia. Today I'm going to talk about the importance of culture in peace. These two are interconnected in many ways. And the most important thing is that if people of the world, they understand the culture, the traditions, the norms, and other aspects of culture in different countries, they never start fighting. They start talking to each other, and especially through music, poetry, paintings, and all other vehicles which are available for humankind to use and manipulate that for the purpose of the peace. Today I'm going to talk about one experience I had myself in the early 1980s, giving you the importance of culture in bringing the community together. In the early 80s, a friend of mine, he was a journalist. He was taking me to different political organizations, and Iranian, of course. And after a while, I noticed that these people disagree on everything, from A to Z. So one day I called him and invited him to the World Bank. I was an economist with the World Bank then, to talk about establishing a cultural society. And I told him that I do music and you do poetry. And this is something that we don't have any disagreement. And this way we can bring communities, Iranian communities, together. And believe it or not, it worked. And since then, since 1982, when we established the Iranian Cultural Society in Washington, the society has had sessions every Monday, every week, on weekly basis. And it's been around some 40 years, that we have used that. So then we invited people of all walks, different political orientation, and they could sit down under the same ceiling and talk to each other. So this shows the importance of culture. That dimension, if you add to other political discussions and so on, it becomes very fruitful. Today I'm going to recite a poem by one of the Iranian prominent poets of the 7th century, Hafiz. And then I try to do a sort of general translation of that poem for you to show you how important Hafiz was talking about eliminating the disagreements among human beings 700 years ago. And this poem, let me recite it in Persian first, because it shows you the rhythm and the rhymes, because if you do translate poetry, you lose the music aspect of it. So let me first read it in Persian. دوش دیدم که ملائک در میخانه زدند، گل آدم بسرشتند و به پیمانه زدند. ساکنان حرم ستر و عفاف ملکوت با من راه نشین باده مستانه زدند. آسمان بار امانت نتوانست کشید، قرعه فال به نام من دیوانه زدند. جنگ 72 ملت همه را عذر بنه چون ندیدند حقیقت ره افسانه زدند. شکر ایزد که میان من و او صلح افتاد، صوفیان رقص کنان ساغر شکرانه زدند. آتشان نیست که از شعله او خندد شمع، آتشان است که در خرمن پروانه زدند. کس چو حافظ نگشاد از رخ اندیشه نقاب، تا سر زلف سخن را به قلم شانه زدند. You see that the beauty of this poem when you listen to the rhymes and the rhythm, شانه زدن, میخانه زدن. This rhyme is repeated over and over again, makes it more beautiful. But let me give you a sort of general translation of this poem so you can understand the message better. Hafiz says, last night I saw the angels knocking at the door of the wine house. And at that time, what they do, they mixed water and soil, and they created man with wine. Of course, not in our religion, the Islamic religion. It says that in the Quran that God created mountains and seas and so on, and asked them to bow. And they couldn't bow because there were oceans and mountains. And then he decided to create angels and ask the angels to bow. But the angels couldn't do it because they were spirits, of course. And then God created man, mixing soil and water, making mud and making the statue, and then gives life to that statue and created man. But here Hafiz says the God didn't use water. Instead, he used wine. And I can explain that in our culture, wine is looking at the world, the beauty and sublimity of the world through intuition, not through your thoughts and brains or rationality. Intuition is important. And when you drink wine, it opens the door for you to look at the world in aesthetic fashion. And then after they created man, they sat down and we had a drink together. And at that time, the whole burden of bringing back the world into perfection was on human beings' shoulder. Because at the beginning the world was perfect, and with the first sin or whatever, this universe became imperfect. Cosmos became imperfect. So according to the religions, if you do good things and then you go to heaven and then God is here and you're here. But according to the Sufis, if you go towards God in this world and the God comes to you, so that it becomes the unity of being. So it's based on the Iranian Irfan and Sufism. So here he says that, you know, the burden is on my shoulder, the Adam's shoulder. And he says the fight between 72 nations, of course, he's talking about the 72 branches of Islam. And he says they were fighting, and the wars between them, it is because they couldn't see the truth, and they started telling their stories. So the truth is not there. If you know the truth, then they don't fight each other. And then he says that between me and God, there was peace, and then all the Sufis started dancing and drank wine as a source of appreciation for this peace between me and God. And later on he uses the fire, and he says that the fire is not for the purpose of the candle to laugh. It's because it's the flame which burned the moth, the butterfly or moth, because here, you know, it shows the love and the passion between the moth and the fire. And it's very important in our Zoroastrian tradition. The fire is very important. It's the source of cleaning up all the sins and so on. And at the end he says, nobody in the world had did better than Hafiz to unveil the rationality between the existence of the universe. Hafiz says it the best. And that was the time when they combed, he uses a metaphor here, he combed the letters, the words, and it's a metaphor saying that at the time when they started talking and explaining the word, Hafiz was the best to explain it. So this is a translation of this poem. I hope you enjoyed it, and I leave it to the questions and answers to answer your questions if you have any. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for that, Nader. And it's totally appropriate given that the topic of this panel is the beauty of the cultures of the world. We're now going to go into the Q&A.
Muchas gracias. Es completamente apropiado, ya que el tema de este panel es la belleza de las culturas del mundo.
Pardon me? Yeah, okay. So we'll now go into the discussion. We can still take questions or comments. You can send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat page. We have a number. Let me start with a couple of comments. And then I'd like to go to Helga to see what she thinks. But the first one is from Helen Borodina, who's been active with the Schiller Institute in Russia. She wrote of John's presentation, "Thank you so much, Fran, die Musik. I'm speechless." And then we have from Elke Zvinga, who says she's from Germany. "Miss Pandor made me understand the necessity and beauty of a multipolar world in peace, justice, and development. I would like to thank the Schiller Institute very much for the opportunity to participate in so many ideas from outstanding speakers." So Helga, having heard this panel, what are your thoughts? What would you like to add to the discussion?
Well, I don't want this panel to end. It's a delight, you know, when you discuss for almost 2 days the danger of nuclear war and, you know, the terrible condition of the world in many regions. To hear then something which is so uplifting is like balm for the soul. So I want to thank all the other panelists for having done an incredible joy for me. Thank you.
And I have to apologize for bringing in Tony Blinken at the beginning, but I think that gets to the whole point of why we need a cultural change. There's a question for Diane that came in. Someone wrote, "I was at the October 26th event in New York City, which combined politics and music, the event for you and Jose. It was remarkable. I think you should always have a musical presentation at a political rally, and I don't mean YMCA, referring to the song at the Trump rallies, and ask for you to say something about how you put that conference together."
Well, I was thinking about how do we elevate this discussion of war and peace, and also art has the power, participating in something beautiful has a way of opening you. We become vulnerable. We dare to take a risk and not have up this hard wall, what Helga mentioned, this ugly, what I guess it was Teddy Roosevelt who gave us this, or the rugged individualism. When you're immersed in something beautiful, then you can shed some of that ugliness and that wall that Paul was talking about, and perhaps be open to hear something in a way different than what you had heard it before. And I think it's really urgent. especially with some of the horrors that we're seeing, it's not right to go away. It's not right to say, well, the suffering in Gaza is so ugly that I just can't even think about it. We have to think about it, but we have to somehow have the strength to take that horror into ourselves and then find a way to take an action which alleviates that suffering, which transforms mankind, which upholds the faith of the beauty of mankind and the inherent goodness of mankind, even in this question of ugliness. So the October 26th event was designed, as people may recall, we had a series of spirituals in between many of the speeches, which were also chosen to help people apprehend the content of what was being said. And then this selection of international music, because what you hear is there is a universality about it all, even as it's different. So that's really why I conceived of it in that way, and others who worked with me on it, and I agree. And while I have the floor, I also just want to add something which I think we have to take up, because people often say, well, do we have to think about this all the time? I mean, isn't there a time to quote unquote relax? And usually when people say relax, what they mean is, isn't there a time when I can be degenerate? Isn't there a time when I can have a thought that's more bestial? Do I really have to contemplate? I mean, why do you have to analyze these things? And the point of this education of our emotions is it shouldn't be a burden to want to strive for perfection of the universe, that is actually a natural condition of humanity. But it does take, because we are encumbered with our physical mortal existence, it does take some effort to put ourselves in that realm of identity. And I think, in a sense, this, what we were hearing from the Persian poet at the end, but you heard it in Frost, Schiller, and particularly what Helga said, this is kind of a universal challenge facing all of us.
There's a question that came in directed to John, but anyone else could take it up after John gets it. But it's a frustrated parent of two teenagers, and he asks, in today's culture, how can one develop the habit of great art that you and Mr. LaRouche spoke about?
Well, my first, can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, my first advice is join a chorus that sings great classical music, if you can find one in your area. Because the act of singing, and also singing with another, and creating that music, or recreating it, and living through that process of recreation, is something exceedingly special. That's why the Schiller Institute, wherever it has the forces to do so, has choruses and has choral singing, as you heard from on the Dona Nobis Pacem. Even when you have a small group, even singing something as simple as a canon, like the Dona Nobis Pacem, is already something which if you sing it to other people, they are amazed, because they're not used to hearing even that level of polyphony, where you have three different voices singing the same thing but with a displacement. When you get into more, the other thing to do is to study the great pieces of music that were written, especially starting with Bach and going through with Beethoven and Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and Dvorak, and there are many other people around in that galaxy. Just to give one example, Carl Maria von Weber, who was a contemporary of Schubert, and who wrote some beautiful things, beautiful operas and so forth. But also Verdi,
And so there's a wealth of things. The one caveat in all of that is that if you just put these things on YouTube and you sort of listen to them, a lot of the stuff on YouTube, it really isn't that good. And I would, in my years of working with Lyndon LaRouche, he revered a very small handful of the world's greatest artist of his time and previous time during the recorded age. In the case of orchestral music, don't bother listening to anything, any Beethoven symphony, for instance, until you've heard some of the performances by Wilhelm Furtwängler, the great German conductor. He was always criticized by the cultural mafia that took over in the late 40s and 50s and so forth, what Helga was talking about. And he was criticized because he gave too much meaning to everything that he did. I mean, how dare you play something with meaning? Music doesn't have any meaning. It's all completely emotional. And unfortunately, a lot of the performances, even of classical, great classical music today, suffers from that assumption, both from the conductors and the players in the orchestra and the audience sometimes, that music is something that's purely emotional, it's purely affective. And what you have to do is you have to get, what I hoped to do in that tiny little talk that I gave today, is to give you an idea that you have to completely get rid of that idea of music as being something with some great wave of emotion. And what it is, you have to start with these, what are called musical ideas. Lyndon LaRouche talked about that. And I could talk a good deal more about it in terms of how that works with the classical music. There's a concept called Motivführung, which was one that was introduced by a great friend of Lyndon LaRouche, Norbert Breinin, who was the chief violinist of the famous Amadeus Quartet. And it's the best translation is motivic thorough composition, which was a method which was invented by Haydn, actually, and where you look at a cluster of notes. It's not really even a melody. It's just a few notes, maybe two, maybe even three notes. And this creates the kernel of the development of a polyphonic idea. And I know that's hard to get, if you don't know much about music, it's hard to get around. That's why, as I said before, the best way to start in on this is to do it. I'll leave it for others to say even more if they want to.
Well, okay, thank you, John. We have a question for Liliana because I know you may have to leave a little bit early. It's someone who writes about your comments about Italian appreciation of music today. And she writes, excuse me, doesn't Italy still have a great tradition of opera? And I can tell you, I was recently had the privilege of being in Verona, the great Colosseum there, and seeing an opera. And there were 12,000 people who came in on a beautiful night into the arena. But the question is, are we seeing a degeneration in Italy also, away from the great operatic tradition of Verdi and others?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, well, the tradition is obviously still there. We just had last night, where we had the premiere at La Scala. It is always the day before today, with Verdi's Forza del Destino, but it was unfortunately, as it's often the case in La Scala, with modern direction. Regie Theatre has ruined a lot of operas at La Scala. including Mozart's Don Giovanni 2 years ago. A British director even changed the end.
Well, we'll see if we can get you back. We can come back to you, Liliana. I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Can you speak now?
Did you hear what I said until now?
The first part, yes.
Okay.
We're talking about La Scala.
There is a degeneration of opera in Italy in terms of, I'm double for some reason, I don't know why. Because of the modern direction, first of all, like they had La Forza del Destino yesterday opening the La Scala season, and this was a Regie Theatre, it was modern direction. And some years ago, a British director destroyed Mozart's Don Giovanni at La Scala, changing the end of it. Instead of ending in hell, Don Giovanni survives. And this indicates what the oligarchy thinks about Mozart's Don Giovanni. And this is often the case, not always. Last year, there was a decent, very good Don Carlos of Verdi, based on Schiller. But the problem which I indicated in my speech about Riccardo Muti, who has been campaigning for this, is that the Italian state is not supporting opera, is not supporting opera theaters. Many are closing down because there is no money, there is no budget for opera, and very often the only people who sponsor Italian opera are the Chinese government and Chinese institutions. That's why Riccardo Muti went to China to give a masterclass on Italian opera. And that is part of the degeneration of the Italian governments ever since Monti, then Draghi, and now with Meloni. They're spending a lot of money on weapons, but they're not spending on culture.
That sounds familiar. There's a question for you, Helga, that I think is quite interesting, and others may want to take it also. It's from Chris Kelly, who writes, "Hello, Helga. You mentioned art should be beautiful or it shouldn't be called art. Are you saying only art that depicts mankind's high points of joy and accomplishment should be classified as art? What about art depicting urban blight and decay, or art depicting genocide in Gaza? Wouldn't they be considered art as well?" And then he asks, in addition, when was the last time period in history when you would consider classical music as art?
Well, beautiful doesn't mean banal. For example, Lessing has written a very interesting treatise about the treatment of the ugly in art, and Schiller has written about that as well. And what they basically maintain is that the ugly, if it is necessary to make a point concerning the content, has to be sort of gone through a sublime transformation. For example, Lessing writes about the famous sculpture, the Laocoon. This was a Greek sculpture where a man is in fight with dragons and snakes together with his two sons. And obviously, this is a fighting scene and they have pain. But if you look at the face of the man screaming of pain, it is not just opening the mouth as wide as he can, but it's a sort of, thought through pain, which still expresses pain completely, but it's not let go, And I think this is very important. This is a famous debate between Aristotle's rhetoric school and the aesthetic education, which developed over the millennia, one can say, where the polemic, especially by Lessing and then later Schiller, is that the artist cannot just go on the stage and scream, "Pain, I'm in pain," there's a very little nice critique by Schiller called On Bürger's Poems. Bürger was a very popular poet of the time who always would have these melodramatic, very emotional descriptions of his love life and various other things. And Schiller said, this is just terrible. This is populist, ugly things. And he makes a caricature of Bürger, and he wrote that in a famous critique, which caused a storm of, people very, very upset about this. But the key point was that in difference to Aristotle, who had this school of rhetoric that you have to just learn how to say things eloquently, disregarding the content, that the Platonic tradition of art demanded that an actor, for example, or a writer of a play, before they go on the stage, they have to intellectually master what is the implication of this emotion. And then if they want to present it for some artistic effect, they have to bring the reflection of that intellectual process in presenting it. So it's no longer the barbarian who screams and rips out his hair and says, "Oh, horrible," but it has to have the classical form to be art. And I think that is something which has been completely lost. And if you look at the stages of the pop music, for example, there's nothing of that. It's just plain, sexual fantasies, working it all out in plain open. And the classical idea is that you have to have some form, which also has an elevation. And I think that is extremely important. And I would suggest that you read the letter exchange between Körner, who was one of the best friends of Friedrich Schiller, and Schiller, where they discuss this question of beauty at length. And Schiller basically comes to the conclusion, saying that if the art is not uplifting, it is not art. So it does not mean everything has to be glorified. In the same way, like the notion of idealization has been completely misunderstood or misrepresented, maybe intentionally. When Schiller idealizes the topic he uses in a poem or in a drama, it doesn't mean that he makes it look nice and look pretty and so forth. It means to get to the essence of what is the content of that idea. And, I give you one example. When he wrote the Wallenstein trilogy, this was in the 30 Years' War, and he wrote the whole history of the 30 Years' War as a sort of historical study before he went to write the play. And he had very few sources because history writing was not so rich at the time. And he nevertheless, in inventing the persons of Thekla and Max Piccolomini, who were talking about the time after the war and what the real intention of Wallenstein would be, these were absolutely the ideas of the Peace of Westphalia, which obviously, was not in Wallenstein's time possible. But 150 years later, when a lot more historical material was available, the historians compared what Schiller had written and what his sources were, and they came to the conclusion that the real history was what Schiller had described. And Schiller obviously had considered that all the material he had was from the Habsburgs and therefore one-sided, and he sort of got the idea of the content of the war and what would follow after the war, and he got it all right. So this is a beautiful example that the process of idealization is an intellectual exercise which gets you to the truth of the matter rather than the appearance, which you only would get in the realm of sense certainty and sense perception. This is an important issue, because even the horrors in Gaza can be portrayed in a beautiful way. I give you an example. There was a little video made by Turkey, which we showed at one of our IPC meetings, which is an incredible moving thing, because it rather than showing the horrors of the dying children and men and women in Gaza, it has a scene where in galleries around the world, people are looking at the way how this genocide is being portrayed by artists in the year 2040. And you have these beautiful pictures of people who were killed. And then the children ask their parents and grandparents, where were you? What did you do? You know, and that makes it so much powerful than if you would show the actual horror, which is, the reality is not uplifting. But if you think about the historical process of what, since this is obviously a reference to what happened in Germany, when a lot of children and you know, young people were asking their parents and grandparents in the 50s and in the 60s, where were you when this horror happened? And this is obviously a poetical working through of that conception, you know, which elevates it and makes people aware of the fact that they're just one element in a long chain of generations of humanity, and there is no escape. You will be judged for your deeds, even if you get away from, you know, punishment today. History will judge you, and that is a metaphor which is much stronger than the actual portrayal of the horror.
Diane?
I just wanted to add, or really in keeping with that, the question of the spiritual, because one could say, wasn't slavery horrible and brutal and filled with hideous, ugly violence? But if you take, and what could be more hideous than thinking of the crucifixion of Christ? And just as the question Helga just asked, if you think of the spiritual, were you there when they crucified my Lord? It's clear that the art, again, lifts you to the universal, what is immortal about humanity in overcoming this incredible adversity. And it just struck me of interest that it creates exactly the same question that she was just saying about the Turkish film, which you definitely would not get, or that tension which impels us to action if you simply dwelt on making everyone experience the brutality of it.
I'd like to bring Bill in on a question that came in. Actually, it's some fan mail for you, Bill. Someone referred to you as the Bard of Boston. But I have to say, I was very impressed by your German recitation of the poem Hoffnung. As Helga can attest, I'm somewhat challenged when it comes to learning German. But I would ask you, and maybe John wants to comment on this also, when you go about looking at a poem, how do you think about the recitation? What are you looking for? Because poetry can be very intimidating. And someone just wrote and said that to do what people just did in this panel with music, with poetry, they're intimidated by it. And it seems as though the average person can't do it. So what would your advice be on how to look at the recitation of a poem?
Well, first of all, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I'd say, well, be hopeful. When I work on poetry, the first thing I try to make sure is, to the best I can, to understand what's being said. And I try to get some insight into what the poet is trying to, what principle is the poet working on and evoking. I often find some people work on poetry, they're really like focused on what it sounds like. But I think first of all, you have to begin to focus on what's the meaning and what is the idea that should be in the mind of the listener when you're done reciting. So I also I wanted to say something about poetry in general and the principle. As Shelley says that, you know, poetry is addressing the imagination, which he contrasts to what he calls the rational faculty, where, I mean, essentially he's equating the creative faculty, contrasted to rational, I guess you could say formal, logical, or maybe another better way of putting it is what another one of my favorite Germans, Einstein, said, which is that imagination is more important than knowledge. So when you're dealing with poetry, you're operating in the realm of the imagination, and you're hoping to get the listener to reproduce an idea that he doesn't have before, an idea that the poet created and that you hopefully have recreated in your mind, and you get them to create it. So it's an issue of imagination. I mean, as Lynn often said, and he was talking about it there in the video in the first panel, you're addressing a work of art is forcing or provoking the viewer or the listener to make sense out of the contradictions or the paradox, to get an insight into the from the ironies, things that contradict, that don't seem to fit together. And this if you get the insight, then there's a new idea. I just would encourage people to just keep working at it. I think it's very important these days, especially after witnessing the last presidential campaign. I think people need to take a lot more responsibility for what comes out of their mouths. And there should be something, there should be a lot more, again, in terms of imagination, there should be a lot more empathy and a lot more of a dialogue rather than, I mean, the rhetoric, et cetera, gets pretty violent. I mean, the idea that the most poorest, desperate people trying to escape an evil situation to someplace relatively safer, that they're the big problem in the world. I mean, I just think that's completely hideous. Anyway, I think I'm sort of getting off my point here. Let me just say one thing I wanted to say. I don't know if I'll get another chance, but in terms of another thing about drama, in William Tell, I mean, I've heard that story since I was very young, before I knew what was really going on there. Tell doesn't want to get involved. He's known as, he's heroic, he's strong, he's courageous, but he doesn't want to get involved in the rebellion. But when he's walking across the square with his son and the emperor's officers, they have the hat up on a pole, and everybody's supposed to bow down to it, and he just ignores it, and then he's stopped, and then he's confronted, and he's told, well, we've heard you're a great archer. Why don't you show us by shooting this apple off your son's head? And then he doesn't want to get involved, but then he gets involved, and because he can see that his posterity is at risk, that this tyrant, this representative of this tyrant, endangers the life and freedom of his son. So he's put on the spot. And I think that's something for people to reflect on. And I'll just say that that goes in line with one of Diane Sare's campaign mottos: "Don't be tragic."
John, did you have something you wanted to say about how to approach poetry? Because what you did with Andy
sure.
Musique was quite poignant.
Yeah, I want to motivate a little bit of what Lyndon said in the quote that I gave, where he said that music is that song is the Rosetta Stone of between poetry and music in general. That you know, because it combines both song and poetry. Song, of course, goes all the way back to the old Vedas, which were the Indian Vedas, which go back millennia, which were sung, and also like the Homer, which was mostly sung, was only written down later. But I want to give a little bit of history of how this worked in terms of our own political movement. In the for many years during beginning that, well, I started working with Lyndon LaRouche in 1971 when I joined. Lyndon could not stand it when people tried to recite poetry. And I think that one of the reasons why he encouraged us all to go in with music is because he found that the poetry recitation, or what passed for poetry recitation in general, at least in English culture, was so horrible that he had to stop his ears. And for many years, people who are in our movement would go up to Lynn and try to recite poetry, and he was totally dissatisfied with it. And I don't know where he would stand today in terms of what I did or what Bill did, but I can say that I think that in general poetic recitation is, especially in English, is a lost art, which needs to be revived. And it's difficult because the best examples of that, of course, of English poetic recitation would be further back before the days of recorded recordings. So for all those reasons, what I decided to do with my life was to devote myself to trying to understand that Rosetta Stone by, again, doing it. And since all of this great music from the German Renaissance is in German, I've worked at it that way. So I think that you can get the same thing from some of the spirituals, but also you can go back to some of the beautiful English song of the Renaissance, which is also very good and is neglected today. Even the songs of Orlando di Lasso, who was working around the time of Kepler. There's plenty of beautiful English song that can actually be worked through. So I recommended highly singing that. I'd just like to say one more thing about about this question that Helga was asked about in terms of beauty, and would recommend that one of the you can also have beauty in not just in poetry, but in a novel that's written poetically. And I would highly recommend the Italian novel I Promessi Sposi by Alessandro Manzoni, which is generally in English, the translation in English is The Betrothed, because it portrays a tremendous ugliness of character, but it ends in what you might call redemption, or actually atonement, would might be the best thing. And I think that it's the novel that inspired Giuseppe Verdi to write his Requiem, the famous Verdi Requiem, in Manzoni's honor, because he was so highly cherished
for this beautiful novel. So I think that in general, anything, what you have to, when you're listening to a piece of music or a piece of poetry, you have to or somebody else doing it, you have to step back and ask yourself, what is the person's, or what is the conductor's or orchestras or orchestras or whatever performers' intention in doing this? Why are they doing this? Why are they, what is their idea? Is their intention behind what they're saying to just entertain, to pass the time away? Or is it an intention to do the kinds of things that Schiller discusses in his aesthetic letters, which is to uplift the audience? If your intention is not that, it's not great art. I don't care how pretty it is and how perfectly done it is. It's not art. Art has to have that intention towards beauty and towards uplifting the audience and the person who's either performing it or listening to it. And to me, that's the measure of anything, and that bridges all times and all spaces. There's no particular era and so forth, but that defines what I would call a classical mindset, a classical mindset, or somebody might call it a Christian humanist mindset or a Confucian mindset. It's that intention, and that can be with anything. Thank you.
Okay, let me just mention that we have a little bit of time left. There are lots of questions, so if people could get right to the point. Is Nader's there? Do you have something that you would like to say on this question of poetic recitation and the overcoming the fears of expressing language, using beautiful poetry to express language? You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
To unmute, where is it? I don't. Where? Oh, it's not muted. Am I good now? It's not muted.
Go ahead and speak.
Okay, I was talking about the importance of music and poetry in bringing the people of the world together. And I gave you an experience of myself, in the 80s, and I'm sure it's going to be relevant for any organization. If you add that dimension to your activities, definitely it's going to have a great impact, especially, when it comes to misunderstandings about various cultures and traditions, norms, religion, whatever. This misunderstanding is the cause of all the evils, in the world. And it's very important that we try to understand each other. And the music especially is the universal language. So you can have that to communicate with the other nations, especially at this time that you have all the wars and genocides in the world. And it's a very, very bad situation. And I'm sure that the Schiller Institute, by taking these steps, I'm sure they're going to be very successful in bringing people of all walks together. Thank you.
Thank you. Helga, I have a question for you from Dino Gavancho from the Christian Democratic Party in Peru. Dino asks, what principles of Chinese and Indian culture do you find that are similar to the classical principles of Western culture based on Greco-Judeo-Christian culture? Principles on which an effective and productive dialogue and cooperation can be forged?
I think that there are both content-wise universal ideas which appear in all cultures. For example, the myth of the creation is in all great civilizations, and they definitely did not know from each other at the time, because traveling was very exhaustive it took months and months to travel someplace. But for example, with the creation mythology, that out of chaos the creator created order, that's an idea which appears in all great texts. In the Bible, naturally, that God in 7 days. I'm not such a Bible, I'm not so Bible secure, but what I'm saying is that this idea that out of chaos order is created, and that the universe is becoming more structured and more orderly, that is a very fascinating idea to me. In the same way, like for example, the Song of Creation in Vedic writings, you have Kusa referring to that, saying that there is the one religion above all the teachings of the different prophets. Then the idea that there is a lawfulness in the cosmos. In China, you have the idea that there is a mandate of heaven, which if the government is not following, the people have the duty to replace such a government. That was long before Confucius. In India, you have the idea that there is a cosmological order which determines the life on Earth and what people should do. In German, in European history and epistemology, it's called natural law. So you have these crucial conceptions which appear, even if the predicates may be different. That's one thing. Then the idea that beauty and poetry and song are educating the mind. You have that in Confucius, you have it in Italian poets, Petrarca, Dante, Schiller. So you have these similar conceptions concerning the content, but then you also have the idea that you have a form. Rhyme is not equal in the difference. Sometimes it's the length of the syllable or the rhythm, or the length of the line, hexameter and things like that. These are different, but the fact that you have these structures which differentiates prose from poetry is a phenomena which you have in every single culture, even if these cultures supposedly did not have any contact with each other. So that is why, for example, it is that we are talking about universal principles, because things, if they are truthful, must be truthful everywhere. That is why Leibniz, for example, said that the mathematical calculations of the emperor Kangxi, who was a contemporary of Leibniz, that he came to the same mathematical conclusions like Leibniz, was the proof that a good creator must be there. So these universal ideas, I think that they are very much worth to be studied, because once you unearth them, you can get a key. It's like a Rosetta Stone to the other culture, because then you recognize that the beauty is that we have such a diverse array of cultures, because how boring it would be if we all would be just the same. And the fact that you have different architecture, different paintings, different poetry makes us so much richer. But despite the diversity, you have a unity, which are these universal ideas underlying it. So the more you study that, the more you see what a beautiful construction our world is. I'm sometimes flabbergasted that people, they run through the city and they shop this and they do this and that, and they completely take everything as self-evident. But have you gone lately in a university clinic and thought about what incredible wealth of discovery in medical science is there accumulated with all the specialists and all the different apparatuses and literature which gives a clue to the most seldom disease? All of that goes back to a couple of great medical scientists like Galen, Hippocrate, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and out of that came this incredible wealth and that's just medical thing. You can take the same thing for every other technology. We are living in a miracle world, and you have to keep an open eye and an open mind to see the things around you, because then you have much more self-confidence about the human mind, and you also feel, in a certain sense, much more human. You're not just an animal stuffing your face whenever you're hungry, but you're living for a purpose, and you have the feeling, if all of these generations have done so much to bring us to this point, I should feel a noble commitment to help with my own doing, that it gets more richly transmitted to the future generations, which is a crucial idea of Schiller in his studies about the universal history, which was in his lecture to the students in Vienna in 1789, which is a beautiful another writings by Schiller, which gives you this idea of how you get an identity as being part of universal history. So, I would say that, I wrote also several articles, which if you want, I can send to you, where I looked at some of the more specific ideas. But I think that gives you an initial idea.
I would encourage people again to look on the Schiller Institute website and consider subscribing to the publication Leonora in English and Ibicus in German, because the kind of discussion we're having here is I guess they're quarterly, but when they come out, these are the kinds of material that should be discussed over the breakfast table or at work. Now, I have just a couple more questions. I want to give everyone a chance at the end to make a comment, but here's one that's a bit of a challenge, I think, from Adrian Pearl, the treasurer for Vega for Congress, who writes, can one or more panelists comment on the importance of architecture? Helga just mentioned the question of architecture. Adrian writes, I find that hideous architecture is more oppressive to the soul than music, because it is impossible to escape if it lies on your daily commute, for example. Now, having lived for years in Houston, I can tell you that's a real problem. In Houston, a historic building is one that stands. It was built in the 1990s. So now living in Germany, you live in these beautiful villages and cities, but can anyone take a crack at this question of architecture? Helga, I thought you would. And then Nader. Go ahead, Helga.
Well, I think Houston I have used many times as the incarnation of ugliness in architecture, because it's all concrete and glass. It has no beauty. It's oppressive, if anything. If you look at architecture, you should look at the great cathedrals. The schools of different cathedrals, the school of Chartres in France, or the cupola in Florence, or other Gothic and other churches in Europe, they are incredibly high. If you're standing in one of these churches and you look up towards the ceiling, you get already, by the construction, by the proportionality of the different things on the wall and the structures like the columns and things like that, you are uplifted right there. And that is in general, the golden mean. The golden mean is not beauty as such, but without the golden mean, it's very difficult to have beauty. In other words, there is a proportionality which is pleasing to the eye. And if you look at many plants, their structure of the leaves and growth is according to the golden means. You have this application in Renaissance buildings, for example, and it has something to do with, in a certain sense, Kepler's discovery of gravitation through the harmony of the planets. There is a harmonic structure in the universe which is, it's fulfilled, pleasing to the eye, And if it's violated, it does the opposite. I mean, if you look, for example, why are people not using the beautiful architecture of the Renaissance in Europe or the classical period to build new buildings? I mean, in my hometown, Trier, there is the famous Porta Nigra. This was the northern gate in a wall around the city. It's a huge black stone construction which has no concrete, it has no nails, it's just the weight of the stones sitting on top of each other, which holds the building together, which is probably, I don't know, I would judge maybe 20-meter high, and it's a gigantic building. And you know that construction to build something so steady that it would last for 2,000 years is amazing. You know, similar, you have other more beautiful buildings, you know, even in middle-aged cities and villages, but all of that beauty is never applied to the modern architecture. It's almost as if modern architecture is designed to give people a feeling of that they have no special identity. In the United States, you go from one mall to the next and it's always the same. You go to a shopping center, it's the same strip. Somebody drops you with a helicopter and you don't know exactly where you are. You go to one of these shopping strips, you have Kentucky Fried Chicken, then you have the pharmacy, then you have CVA or whatever the pharmacy is called, then you have, in any case, it's always the same. It's oppressive like hell. It's a complete contempt for the aesthetic sense of the people who are supposed to live there. Contrary, you know, in China, I have seen modern buildings where they apply the architecture of the ancient temples. I have been in India, in Jaipur, where the building of the city council and the mayor are built according to the architecture of the Maharaja palaces. You know, obviously with modern technology and machines, it is so much more easy to build complicated structures than it was at the time when people just had manual work. But obviously the utilitarian approach that everything has to be just, you know, for profit is in contradiction to building beautiful things. You know, I have written an article many years ago where called for building of a new Cusanus city, where we actually did the first shoveling that actually was not built. But this was the idea, to build a new science city where you would apply Cusanus's principle of unity in diversity, which is actually in the original hospital which Cusanus donated, which is still an old people's home for 600 years in a row. But this idea that you have a unifying principle, but artistic expression in diversity, that is something which can be applied in architecture, and it would immediately make it completely different. So it's a challenge to future architects to really build beautiful cities again.
Thank you for that, Helga. Nader, did you want to say something on architecture? Because what
yeah,
we're
just
about to
yeah,
do, let me
yeah,
just
just
say this.
I'm
I'm going to give everyone a chance to do a short summary statement on this question of the importance of culture. But go ahead, Nader, on architecture.
Yeah, it's just mine is very brief. It's they say that architecture is nothing but music frozen, you know. And in our culture, especially the music, there is a deep relationship between our music and the architecture, especially if you look at the mosques and the beauty there, you know, it seems to be formless. There's no form, there is no shape. But at the same time, it's very detailed and it's a miniature type, you know. And unlike the music in the Western culture, which is the blocks of harmonies and so on, our is just like very ornamental, and it's very detailed, and it's exactly the same as our Persian carpets and also the mosques. I just wanted to tell you the relationship between the architecture and music in our culture.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your contributions to this panel.
Thank you.
Given that we're taking up this question of the dialogue of civilizations. So I'd like to give everyone a couple minutes to just give a summary of your thoughts on this question of culture and where we go from here. The world is in an incredible crisis right now. The idea of beauty seems to be lacking from the thinking of anyone in the West. But I think this panel today provided a lot of material for people to mull over and work on. But why don't we start with Bill? Summary thoughts, Bill.
Well, I remember somebody told me something about how the City Hall in Boston was constructed to keep rioting citizens from getting to the mayor and the city council. And I looked it up, and they said it was a prime example of brutalist architecture. So I'm not sure what that means, but the fact that they would be that honest to call it brutalist, they know what they're doing. So that's something we need to fix. All right, 2 quotes with regard to what Lynn said in that paper that I quoted. At the very ending of Ode to a Grecian Urn, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. And then let me quote Diane Sare again, don't be tragic.
Okay, thank you for that. John, closing thoughts?
There's a lot of beauty in, part of our development as an organization was our discovery, and it was a process of a number of years, of the beauty of what the American Revolution represented and what led up to that. There's a tremendous amount of research that we've done on that. I just wanted to point out one very small aspect, but it's well, actually two little aspects. One, just to give you an idea of the kind of culture that that America had. I happened to be just for Thanksgiving. I happened to be visiting with some part of my family that I'd never met before in Louisville, Kentucky, and it turns out that in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the founding members was a man by the name of George Keats, who was the brother of the poet John Keats, and who actually, came to Louisville on a riverboat and participated in the building of it, and would continue for as long as his brother John lived. Had a very lively correspondence with it. The other thing is that one of our discoveries was, which I participated in, was the discovery that this idea in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where he says "Freude, schöner Götterfunken," right, which is joy, beautiful, divine spark, Götterfunken. That this actually is a reference to Benjamin Franklin, specifically. Schiller wrote that poem in 1785, and there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for the American Revolution, but also then looking forward to the hopes that maybe there could be such a revolution in Europe, specifically in France. Of course, the French Revolution was a total disappointment, but I just wanted to cite just a little bit of a writing by an American enthusiast, Georg Forster, who was writing in 1790 a praise of Benjamin Franklin. And he was, at the time, he was the librarian of the city of Mainz. That's a whole history in itself. But he writes, Benjamin Franklin, venerable spirit, may you yourself teach the population with your great, unforgettable example. I can hear your voice now. I can still make out your words. Quote, Children of Europe, honor the divine spark, göttlicher Funke, the divine spark of reason within you, and perfect yourselves through its use. Freedom can only be attained by virtue. Virtue is only possible through reason. Rage and hatred can only spill blood. You cannot buy freedom, however, with blood. No, you will only purchase shame, remorse, suffering. You will kill your joy and your peace. Therefore, what costs blood is not worth blood. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane, summary thoughts?
I would like to respond to what Liliana reported to us about the British director who destroyed Don Giovanni, because this is the most important point, that Don Giovanni, because he refuses to repent and atone, his final party, he ends up burning in hell. He's swallowed up in hell. And Lyndon LaRouche made a big deal that his friends who watched him refuse to change and get swallowed up in hell, nonetheless go about their daily business and hold a party, a wedding celebration or whatever it was. I forget but they are absolutely unaffected by the fact that he just burned in hell. And I think that's a very good analogy for what we are facing. What I heard Scott Ritter report yesterday in some of his meetings with people in Washington, D.C., he said he couldn't, it was a privileged conversation, but he said, so who is it that's giving Joe Biden these crazy briefings that Putin is bluffing? Why does Biden think Putin is bluffing? And the person said, oh, they don't think Putin is bluffing. They know that Putin is serious, but they believe that they can survive and win a nuclear war. So one of the reasons why we have art is so that we don't have to make the mistakes that prove to be terminal and fatal to people who went before. And that is my concluding thought.
And Helga, the founder of the Schiller Institute, who we proudly celebrate 40 years of Schiller Institute activity, your summary.
Okay, Lyndon LaRouche said, and I think he also wrote it, that a society which is not capable of classical thinking is not fit to survive. And I think that that is a very actual question for us today, exactly because I think, you know, as this Thomas Buchanan Rear Admiral was saying publicly, you know, they really think they can win a nuclear war, and therefore a population which is not capable of responding to such a threat obviously is not fit to survive. And why is it that the classical mindset is required? Most people are thinking in such a sloppy way that I'm always horrified, because they can't keep a thought together. When they have a conversation among each other, it's like a talk show. You know, one person says, oh, this morning I got up early. And then the next one says, early is, better than to be late. And tomorrow I will do the following green soup. And then they says, oh, green, I will wear a new dress. And that is what, a dress, you should always dress. So people, it's like in German, there is the word from Hölzchen auf Stöckchen, which means that you jump, whatever opportunity you have to change the attention, you get distracted, you start a new subject, you don't follow through a thought. I mean, that is what is the mental disease of most people. And if you then look at the classical poems, and I could give you many examples, but look at two. One is called The Bell by Schiller, which is a long poem. I think it's 17 minutes long. It has three layers. One is building of the bell, very detailed construction. Then the second one is the personal life, the childhood, marriage, and death. And then the third level is what happens to society. And these three levels are almost like a fugal polyphonic composition set against each other, and they always change from one to the next level. And it starts with one idea, but it ends with all three levels being concluded in the word concordia, unity. And a similar method is applied in another poem by Schiller called The Artists, where, this is also an enormously long poem, which Schiller, did not agree with his own classical form in later on, but it's a beautiful poem. And it has the same thing. It goes through all these developments, all the different thoughts are exhausted. And then it ends that basically all of these tendencies are interwoven into one. And it's concluded. This is the method of exhaustion, that you have a topic, you think it through, you develop all possible potentialities, and then you come to a conclusion on a higher level. And that is the essence of classical thinking, because, that is also why Schiller said about himself that all of his works are to uplift people and ennoble them and make them better people. Because if you're not trying to elevate the mind above the level of the different predicates into a higher one, into a higher unit, into the sublime, you are not accomplishing anything. But if you are trained to think that way, you can think things through. And, you will recognize that in order to think even strategy, you have to have a classical education, if you want to come up with a positive solution. Naturally, if you go for destruction only, you may not require that ability. So I can only say, the question of dealing with the classical mindset may turn out to be a question of the very survival of humanity at this point. So do it.
So let me encourage people to go to the Schiller Institute website, become a member, find out where there are potential meetings. We have Zoom calls. We have the International Peace Coalition, which meets every week. And I would also encourage people to subscribe to the publications Leonora and Ibicus. So thank you to all the panelists. This has been a very stimulating discussion, and we have to do it again. So with that, good evening.